the radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this October 7th. October 7th, 1 year later. It's been quite a year. It was quite a day on October 7th. Really, I don't think for me, it really had the realization of what was going on until maybe a day later. I remember going live on the 7th, but not quite realizing how horrific what was going on. And it took a while for it all to really sink in. So to talk about this last year and its meaning and significance, and maybe talk a little bit about what we can expect looking into the future. We've got Elan Journo. Thanks, Elan, for joining me. I think you're all familiar with Elan. Elan, I don't know what the official title is these days, but Elan, to a large extent, is our foreign policy guy at the Ayn Rand Institute, and is a senior fellow and is a commentator and on all issues foreign policy, in particular on the Middle East. So thanks for joining me, Elan.
It's good to be here. Not that I'm glad to be here marking a year since October 7th, but it's an important issue, and I'm glad to be here with you to talk about it.
Yeah. So if we look back at this last year, what would you say was the thing that surprised you the most over the last year?
I think there are two things that come to mind. One is, and I'm embarrassed to say I was surprised by it, because I should have had a better understanding of this, I guess. Yeah. One is what we learned about higher education and what that institution across the country and across, I think, Western countries generally, what it's been turning out, and the kind of thinking in the humanities that many of the protesters demonstrated. And again, there's lots of questions about who was pushing these protests, but there was real support for what they were doing. And I'm speaking here for people just jumping in. The encampments we saw at elite universities across the country, and the messages that the people there were pushing, the flags they were flying. And I would remind people that it was not only the Hamas flags, there was also Hezbollah flags, which is important to recognize now that Israel's in a more concerted effort against them.
It's going on today, right? I mean, it's going on right now as we speak at major American universities. They're using this day to continue their protests.
Yeah. So that's just at a headline level. I'm sure we could dig into it. At a headline level, that's one of the things that I was taken aback by, I guess, is maybe more accurate. And then it all sort of clicked into place once you start reflecting on what are they saying, what is the frame that they're using. And there's more to say about that. We can come back to it. But the other one that I'm not really surprised, but it's maybe I'll just say there's a level of evasion, and I mean that in the distinctive Ayn Rand sense of not wanting to face the facts and refusing to face facts and making up stories to deceive oneself about what's actually happening in this conflict. And I when I wrote the book, What Justice Demands, I spent a long time reading into this field. Long before I started the book, I was reading about it for a long time. I think the first time I got really interested in this, we were working together on something in the year 2000, sort of the Israel's rise, and so on. Got really interested in that. And all the way through that period, I realized there's just a lot of dishonesty going on in how people understand the conflict, what is going on each side. But if ever there was a moment of clarity about what's going on here, you have a day a year ago exactly where one side in this conflict showed who they actually are, which is barbarians, enemies of civilization, slaughterers, murderers, rapists, executioners. And the other side showed what it was. It was being victimized despite being more powerful, despite being free. And that should be a bright line for people, but it is not. And that's to me one of the saddest things in this last year, that moral clarity that should be. I think a lot of people woke up and thought, yeah, I don't think I can be part of what this whole pro-Palestinian situation can be about if this is what the vanguard of the Palestinians is about. And there have been people who walked away from it. But tying this to the first point, there are people who are attracted by this in a perverse way, and that's sort of the overall recognition that I would bring forward, and it's something I'm really interested in explaining to people. How is it that, having seen what Hamas did on October 7th, there are people who are now taking the time out of their lives and going to protests and camping and all the disruptions that we've seen across the country, closing down bridges, closing down roads, going on they want to see Israel fall, and that is what's driving them. And to me, that you have to be evading so much to see that as a goal, and to tell yourselves fantasies in thinking about who's in the right and who's in the wrong. And that's really the biggest part of this.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think both. I mean, in a sense, I was surprised and not surprised by the demonstrations. All the reasoning, all the philosophy behind it was not surprising. All the philosophy that has gone into the way these kids have been taught and what they've been taught, and the altruism driving all of it deep down, the irrationality, and yet the sheer nihilism of it, the sheer hatred of everything good in this world that this really symbolizes, that shocked me and still shocks me. I mean, I'm still furious today when I looked earlier and saw they're raising the Palestinian flag in Chicago right now, and I think right in front of one big building, a huge Palestinian flag in the midst of Chicago. And you're right, the evasion that is required in order to just go, yeah, okay. I mean, and then the second part of it is what you mentioned, I think is true, the evasion. There it's broader, right? So it's not just these kids. There I find it with all these middle of the road commentators, even some pro-Israel commentators, but who want Israel to be restrained, who don't exaggerate, don't go too far. In some senses, they're worse because they're not nihilists. They don't want to just see the world burn. They've actually taken the time to present themselves pro-Israeli, and then to have this compromising, mealy-mouthed, clear evasion. That is, again, I understand it. I know it's happening. It's not surprising. It's still shocking, and it shocks me every time I see it.
Yeah, it's a good example of something that Ayn Rand talks about, which is how altruism unleashes worse evils. So the person who's a compromiser or a middle of the roader doesn't really want to push hard. The people who are telling you, oh, you need to have a ceasefire, you need to have more stringent rules of war, you need to be concerned with humanitarian issues and feeding the Palestinians, all of that, I think, is coming from an altruistic base. This idea of morality is defined by self-sacrifice, and the strong have to sacrifice for the weak, and how could you not be concerned with the Palestinians? All of that is, I think, in part creating cover for the people who are pretending to be pro-Palestinians but actually anti-Israel. And I think that's an important differentiation that is lost. I say that I agree with the middle of the road kind of commentators are in some ways worse because they should know better. It doesn't, you don't have to spend 20 years reading into this field to think this just doesn't add up. You have one free society and everyone's trying to destroy it. And what you want to focus on is the number of trucks that get in or out, and the stringency of how much they check for explosives and cement material in the trucks, because we know what that led to. Just the dropping of context of how we got here, the scale of the complicity of people in Gaza, which I think doesn't get enough attention. And I think it's Ayn Rand's essays about the 60s and the 70s, and she's talking about how bad things are, and you put that in the scale of today. I don't know how she would react to this. It's beyond belief that you could have documented murders and rapes on a mass scale, And what we're focused on is the Israelis are not giving enough notice to people. They're not allowing enough trucks in. How dare they defend themselves? And that is a symptom of a culture that is really morally sick.
Yeah, I really don't think. I mean, Ayn Rand wrote some of the most evil, horrible, villains in all of human literature, and she spoke about the evils of the left and primarily of the left in the '60s and the student demonstrators. I don't think she could have imagined this. I mean, it really. I don't think people around today get how how really evil this is, the depths of evil. I mean, altruism's been around since Christianity and a lot of evil stuff, but in modern times, it, this is the most vicious manifestation of it that I've seen. The celebration of rapists and mass murderers, and if you go historically, there've been lots of examples that are just as bad or worse. But in modern times, over the last 200 years, other than the Nazis and the communists, well, the communists, where you go, hundreds of millions. But this is up there with that, and this is in the West. This is the good guys. This is in the right, in the place of good people.
I wanted to raise one more thing about campus because I went by that quickly, but I want to share an anecdote from the last couple of weeks. I was invited to a few campuses to speak in the last few months. I'm not going to tell you which campus this is happening in, but I was invited to speak at a campus, and I was going back and forth with the student group that is sponsoring or wanted to sponsor the event, and they wanted me to speak this month. And I thought, well, the natural thing to talk about on campus is this is the big issue. And there's things to say about the encampments and the things to say about Israel and the conflict and how to understand it. And when they got back to me after having a committee meeting, they said, sorry, I should add that the other thing I told them is, as a rule, I don't speak on campus without security. That's just been true for at least a decade now. It's just not sensible, and my wife would not be happy if I did that. So, and it's been justified on other. And I said that just as as a precaution, they need to tell security, they need to tell the campus police, and that's a condition. And I hope they're okay with that. When they got back to me, they were eager for me to speak, but they decided that's not a topic that they feel comfortable with because at this campus, and it's not one that you've heard about in the news, there has already been turmoil because some students have said things positive about Israel and negative, and there's concerns on campus. And again, this is where we are at a fairly well-respected university. The students just said, "Can we talk about something else?" And I said, "I'm fine. I'll talk about something else. I don't want to put you in a position where you're in trouble or you're a threat." Because that's the climate that you can't, students are afraid to bring a speaker like me to present a position on Israel that, given the kind of climate that exists on campus, now that is really sinister to me.
No, I've experienced that for the last year. I've offered myself to many campuses to come and speak on Israel, and everybody's turned me down. And usually it's the university saying, well, we need security and that will cost too much money and we're not sure we want, it's controversial. And then often it's just the students just not wanting the aggravation to handle it. But yes, our side is in a sense silenced by the unwillingness of university campuses to protect our freedom of speech, to protect the students' freedom of speech by inviting us. And it really is horrific. It really is. That really is. Now, we got a little bit of that after 9/11. That's when we discovered security. And with the Danish cartoons, we had a little bit of that. But ultimately, we navigated that and we got events. And this last year, it's been impossible. Other than the University of Texas, it's been impossible to get anything anyway. Yeah, we'll see how that develops in the future. So let's talk a little bit about what it is about why in a sense the demonstration shouldn't be surprising, right? Why this nihilism, where does it come from? Where is this viciousness on American campuses? Where's that really coming from?
The best explanation I have heard, and it's in conversations with my colleague Onkar Gate and the back and forth on this issue. We wrote a piece about this in October of 2023, when a lot of university donors were pulling back. And one of the points, and we put this in an op-ed, one of the points that came out in that, and I remember it because my analysis was, I think, on the right track, but when I collaborated with Onkar on the piece, because we co-wrote it, he brought in a perspective that was just a lot deeper and more philosophical. And I think the way I would summarize it is, these are a new packaging for old ideas that have been around for a long time. And the way you might think of this is the colonizer, colonized, oppressor, oppressive, that whole frame is recent in its salience. Like we're hearing more about it. It's more the language that's been spoken. If you think 20 years ago, the way this was understood, there were different labels for what the conflict was, but the essence, the common theme that unites these different brandings or different labels for it is a hostility to reason, science, freedom, capitalism, technology, all the fruits of the Enlightenment that we have and that are powering our civilization, not understood, not defended. And what we've seen is the growth of the anti-enlightenment trend that's been around for 200 plus years. So it didn't start September 2023. I mean, there's certain events happened, but the thinking and the trend line that led us to the point of this colonializing frame and then the oppressor, that's a new take on multiculturalism, which itself is a version of egalitarianism in the sense of cutting down the strong in the name of zero, in the name of nihilism. And that thread goes back to the reactions to the Enlightenment and the fact that the Enlightenment wasn't and hasn't still been fully defended philosophically. And so I think that's the thread. So why do they hate Israel? Why do they hate the United States? Why do they relish in the prospect of cutting down Israel? Because it's for the sake of its virtues. It's not because it's a Jewish state primarily. It's because it is a successful, incidentally Jewish state. It's because it's a free, incidentally Jewish state. Its essential character is what they see as a rebuke to them and something they can't allow to exist and continue because they hate the kind of thinking and effort that is what produces that. So fundamentally, it's a rebellion against value at the deepest level. It's a rebellion against thinking and creating of value. So that's the essence of what this is. And it's been going on for a long time. And in that sense, it shouldn't be surprising. It's just the manifestations of it have changed over time. There's new formulations, new theorizing of the same kind of reaction. And I think it's important here to stress, it's a mistake. It's understandable. It's a mistake to think that this is all about compassion for suffering Palestinians. That's one of the things that when you pull out the altruistic or self-sacrificial thread in this, that's part of the way in which this is rationalized. It's given a veneer of concern with moral ideas. It is not motivated by that. If you really, and a lot of people have been making this point in different ways, if you really cared about the people in Palestinian territories who are innocent, so as few as there might be still, what you would want for them is not a future where Hamas wins or even exists. You would want for them a future that looks much more like Israel. You would want them to be freer. You would want them to have prosperity. And that's exactly what none of the pro-Palestinians, actually pro-Hamas people, they're not advocating for that. They're advocating for the destruction of the one thing that would, if you really cared about Palestinians, would help them, which is becoming more integrated into Israeli society, more peaceful, more prosperous. So that is a telltale sign that this is not motivated by any kind of positive concern for actual values. It's motivated by the desire to smash what actually causes and enables values to be created.
Well, and yes, absolutely. And the very fact that on September 8th, they already had their statements, that today they're out demonstrating, that is, they're linking their support, supposed support for the Palestinians, with an act of barbarism. That is not caring about Palestinians. That is sheer hatred for Israel and what it represents. And I do think Jews have something to do with this, because I think it fits into kind of a broader narrative of Jews being successful and Jews being capitalists, going back to Karl Marx, where Jews are linked to capitalism, so and to selfishness and to money and things like that. So this is a broad attack on capitalism and on the West. And
I agree with that. The point I'm trying to emphasize in saying it's incidentally Jewish is it's not because they pray and they have a Torah. Or they have these religious rules versus those religious rules. There is a culture that has arisen around production and trade and in finance in particular. If you think about the history of usury and the way Jews are vilified for that, yes, there is a strong association of Jews with capitalism, and that's certainly really central to this. But it's not the essential is not they're hated primarily because they're Jews. It's they're hated for the aspects of their Jewish culture that you would point to as this is about capitalism, this is about innovation, this is about the use of the mind in creating values in human life.
yeah, I mean, and this is why it's ultimately a hatred of America, in addition to a hatred of Israel. It is so. If we look at what's being taught at the universities and kind of how it brought us here, what's the antidote? I mean, so it's in the short run, in the long run, how do we get out of this situation?
That's a tough question. Thanks for setting it up.
Yeah.
I can think of a few things. One is I think it has been a positive that more people are paying attention to what's happening in academia. So I mentioned earlier, big donors were stepping away, and there's a lot of news around that about a year ago. And one question has been, will they go back and assume that it's enough to change the personnel leading some of these? My hope is that they become more concerned with what they've been investing in, what they're donating to support. So one good thing that could help here is, insofar as people think they can support universities as alumni, they put some strings on there. They really give more thought to what ideas are they advocating. So that's one thing that's a near-term thing that would make a big difference. And it really is a responsibility. So whatever scale of donor someone is to a university, this is a point Ayn Rand made, I think, in her last speech, which is the sanction of the victim. Like, if you're going to give money to universities, you jolly well pay attention to what they're going to use it for. And if you think that there's some chance it will be used against you, which in fact there's every reason to think that's exactly what will happen because of all the trends in universities for the last 100 years, you can't allow that. And to me, that's an opportunity for people to have leverage on universities and to just, we're not funding this. And if you want something, I want to center on the foundations of capitalism and the Enlightenment, and you bring in better scholars and have to. So that would be a small positive near-term kind of thing. But I think the long-term direction that's needed, and I hope this isn't just my sort of role at the Institute speaking, and it's actually, I'm convinced of this, so this is why I would raise it, but it can sound like, yes, you ask me what we should do, and I help to develop intellectuals, and I think the role of the Institute here, the Ayn Rand Institute, is we think our strategy depends on finding, training, and setting off into the culture new intellectuals who are advocates of reason, individualism, and capitalism, who can be the voice to defend the best of the Enlightenment, to defend the best of Western civilization. And that's really the long term. And it's not like there's some shortcut to this. Like, you really need better intellectuals, better ideas, because part of what got us here is the negligence of better people, the default of intellectuals, the default of people who should have been saying, Edward Said, who you've probably talked about it, and we've talked about it in other contexts. Edward Said, who's just reshaped the humanities and particularly Middle East studies for decades. He succeeded, and there's this whole industry around him. And part of the reason we have this concept now, this frame of the Middle East, the Israel conflict, as one of oppressors and colonizers, it's in due significant part in due result of his influence. What if at the time he was rising to stature, there were more intellectuals, better intellectuals, and poking through what he was saying instead of me tooing and conforming and going along with this, when they know this is shoddy scholarship at minimum and just false in fundamentals. What if you had better intellectuals to do that and offset it and actually advocate for something positive and to say, no, it's actually much better for the Middle East to have an Israel in its midst for the people to look up to than it is for his analysis of things, and then all the work that he did to whitewash the Palestinian movement for decades too. What if you had intellectuals able effectively to counter that in the same way as they would say, yeah, what you really need is a movement that's concerned with individual rights, as opposed to what they were actually concerned with, which is creating new dictatorships.
You know, a lot of the better commentators out there, I don't know, the Barry Weisses of the world, if you will, are pretty good about pointing out the anti-Semitism and pretty good even criticizing some of the anti-colonial literature. Some people in the center left and center right are pretty good about covering all this stuff. But it seems that they're still missing the plot, right? They're getting they're getting it up to a point and they can't go, you know, they can't go any deeper. And
Yeah. Yeah. Did you, this is a good example. Did you listen to Barry Weiss's interview with Douglas Murray recently?
I didn't.
Okay, well, a lot of people have, and a lot of people sent it to me. Say, oh, this is
Yeah.
great. And I think there's a lot of good things in what he's been doing the last year. He's admirable. He ran
Yeah, he's got
into,
moral courage. There's no
yeah,
question
he
about that.
does. But this is a good example of he's one of the better voices on this topic. And listening to it, I was frustrated repeatedly because Barry Weiss asked him some good questions about what's happening, what's going on, which are questions that would lead you to go deeper. And the answer that he keeps going back to, he has sort of an interesting rhetorical strategy. He's very good at pointing out inconsistencies of a principle and therefore hypocrisy and double standards. And that's a big part of what needs to be done, is to show, why aren't these kids on college campuses? Don't they realize that they would be the first ones to be rounded up under Hamas? Why they don't really want to? So he's good at that. But the
Yeah.
other piece of his rhetorical strategy, or just the depth of his analysis, which is a point where I disagree with him, is he will get to a point where he will explain something in terms of moral rot or moral decay. And I think there's truth in that. There is rot, and it is about moral ideas. But what is exactly moral rot? What is the phenomenon? And what does it look like for something not to be rotten and in fact to be morally wholesome and morally fruitful, morally productive? And part of what you would need, I think, what this is a point I would argue with him about, is yes, we have to point out the rot. You have to also point out what would it look like to go in a better direction. And I haven't heard him say, other than, yes, Israel should defeat Hamas. I agree with that. But beyond that is, well, what is the positive ideals that need to be advocated for here? And I have to say, I think we might have talked about this in another setting, but his book on the war on the West, I think, is symptomatic of this, which is, yes, there is a war. There's a lot of things being done to undermine the West. What is the West exactly? It can't be what he says in the end of the book, and I have a lot of concerns about that. There needs to be a positive vision, and that's a philosophical vision, a moral vision, a political vision. It can't just be that you point and hold your nose and say, "It's moral rot. We need better people." Well, where do they come from? How do you make them? What are they going to say that isn't rotten? And that to me is part of what sort of, there's a thread through that conversation, which is it's you cheer for 1 minute and then you think, well, where do we go from there other than that?
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of conversations I had after 9/11 with Daniel Pipes. Same phenomena, right? I mean, he was very, very, very good in so many different things. But then when you actually, okay, well, what's the alternative? It just ended there, and it couldn't proceed. And I think so. Yeah, I mean, Douglas Murray, I've had 2 live conversations with him in front of an audience, and it always boils down to we don't have the same conception of what Western civilization is and what the positive values of Western civilization are. And as a consequence, his solutions are the wrong solutions to the problem. He can identify the problem as Pipes can. He can even say we need a win, but then what does that mean? What does that look like? What do you have to do? What is the moral code that you would have to advocate for in order to win? It's a complete blank out.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'd add one other thing here, which is one thing that I try to do in my work, and I know you've done this as well. When one's defending Israel, as he's done very courageously and just really just effectively across the last year plus, I think it's important to be able to talk about where Israel is falling short. And I don't just mean in the battlefield. I mean, there are real problems that Israelis are creating for themselves. And it's important to understand how and what they are. Because if you're going to advocate for the defense of the West and you think of Israel as part of the West, you can't also be for these developments in Israel. And one of them is this, again, something that's gotten a lot of attention. That there was an in-depth report in the New York Times that went on their daily podcast. It's the phenomenon of Israeli fanatical Jews and the settlers. And the way this is typically talked about is these people who are fanatical religious Jews are creating a problem. That's an obstacle to the two-state solution. We got to stop the settlements. That's not really the right analysis here. That's not the problem why the two-state solution hasn't happened. But it is a problem for Israel's ability to maintain a rule of law. If you have politicians in not only in parliament but also in the cabinet whose view is that illegal activity or immoral activity, and sometimes it's both, is eroding the rule of law, and it's eroding the separation of religion and state. If you aren't able to talk about that, I don't think you're really credible about what a future of Israel is and how it could flourish, because it needs to improve in those areas, not because this is the obstacle to peace, but it's because it's the obstacle to Israel becoming a much better, freer, more prosperous society. And I have to tell you, before October 7th, I'm sure you noticed this, there were massive protests in Israel because Netanyahu was not popular. And there's a lot of economic issues and political issues. And the big one was the Supreme Court that he was trying to change. We don't have to get into that. And I think that's a complex topic. But the reality is, like the United States, Israel is a society that needs to grow and improve from its basic virtue. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to talk about the Hamas war, yes, it's not the first thing you talk about, but it can't be something you never talk about, because otherwise you're not really being objective in your analysis of what you're dealing with.
Yeah, but you see, but Douglas Murray exactly can't, because he views religion as an important part of what Western civilization is, and particularly Christianity, but it's the Judeo-Christian, whatever. So to him, it's not clear there should be a real separation of church and state. There should be some, but how far he's willing to go is not clear. And it certainly shouldn't be philosophical, or there shouldn't be this, my view is you need to reject Christianity in order to really establish Western civilization. And his view is, no, Christianity is Western civilization. And that makes it impossible for him, particularly on issues of state and religion. It's impossible for him to be critical of Israel on these kind of things. But yeah, I agree completely. I mean, there's a lot going on behind the surface in Israel that is really, really bad. And Netanyahu reasserting and reestablishing his power, over the last few weeks is really, really bad for, I think, the future of Israel, because he is allowing for the complete deterioration of the rule of law. There's whole issues about who's running the police right now and what are the priorities and how that's all handled, and about the ultra-Orthodox being recruited to army or not. I mean, there's a huge number of issues that relate to church and state that are just being corrupted by the Netanyahu government. So let's turn now maybe to Israel and to the response to October 7th, and how you evaluate kind of the response. I mean, you wrote or you edited a book and wrote a number of essays on winning the unwinnable war, and there's a sense in which this war is the real unwinnable war, right? I mean, if from the perspective of almost everybody out there, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you can't solve that one. And there's a real, I mean, we're a year into this. Yes, Hamas has been devastated. Gaza has been devastated. Yes, Hezbollah is taking huge losses right now, and some of the stuff Israel's doing is quite admirable in terms of its ability to destroy Hezbollah, but it's still going on, and there's no end in sight. Iran lobs missiles into Israel, the largest ballistic missile attack in human history, and we're still waiting to see what will happen, and nothing's happening. This could last for years. So, it really does seem like the unwinnable war. And of course, it turned out that the Afghanistan-Iraq war wasn't unwinnable, but it wasn't won, put it that way. It wasn't won, and it's still going on. And you could argue, maybe we should, that this is a continuation of that to some extent. There's definitely a relationship between what happened in 9/11 and what happened in 10/7. So how do you evaluate Israel's response and where we are in this war, in this ongoing war?
I agree with your comment that tactically and at the mission level, there's really impressive things like the pager attack in Lebanon and the walkie-talkie, and that's a level of sophistication. Well, think about how long ago this had to have started as a strategy, as a whole plan, and to carry it out effectively. And my impression as well within Gaza, insofar as there is clear objectives, the Israeli military is capable of doing things. But I've also heard things that suggest that at a strategy, at a higher level, sort of goal level, there isn't anything like the kind of clarity that's needed. And in that sense, I think that I do worry that this is in effect the replay of the errors of Iraq and Afghanistan, and for the same reasons. So what I mean by the strategy level or the higher order goal level, I haven't verified this firsthand, but my understanding from people who have studied this is one of the things Israel's done in Gaza is they would clear an area and then they would move on. And then the area gets refilled by Hamas. They sort of reinstate themselves, and then you go back and refight it. And that is, I don't know military strategy, but that doesn't make any sense to me. And
they're fighting in a neighborhood. They just cleared out another neighborhood.
Yeah.
Yesterday, and they're fighting today in this neighborhood. This is a neighborhood they've been in 3 times already.
Yeah. Yeah. So that doesn't make sense. And so what exactly are they doing? And the fact that we're a year in, when this time last year, even in November, I was surprised that we were still talking about the war, because it was clear to me it could have been accomplished. The goal of defeating Hamas could have been accomplished much sooner. And I think I don't know if it can still be accomplished at this point because of all the time that's been spent and lost, and the advantages that have been forfeited in the time that's been spent. But I really don't think their goal is, and if it ever was, it's no longer to defeat Hamas and actually defeat it in the full definition of they give up. And a lot of things that you hear, I've heard and read about in the last 12 months, there's a lot of telegraphing from Israeli voices, former military, unidentified military, just trying to float these weather balloons of you can't kill an idea. And we've heard that before. You can't destroy people, but that's just not historically true. I mean, you can. I mean, the Nazis are defeated. There are neo-Nazis, but that's nothing like the Nazis. And the imperialist Japanese, that idea is done for. There might still be people who want to recreate it, and they go and do cosplay maybe, or they go online and but it's nothing like the same phenomenon. And you can defeat an idea, and that the idea needs to be defeated, and that's not at all what seems to be the Israeli goal. And that to me is the the takeaway from the last 12 months, why are we here still is the question. It should have been dealt with much earlier. And then the other thing I will say is I'm sure you've said this often, and I've heard you say it when we've talked. There isn't any substitute for victory. There really isn't. But you can't look at this conflict and say it started October 7th. Let's get to an endpoint. It's okay. They're starting with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tunnels that are long and involved and high tech. So you have to look back at how did you actually get here? And that is itself a symptom of a deep problem with the Israeli military and sort of political strategy, which is how did you let yourself get to the point that they not only were able to carry out the attacks of October 7th, but emplace themselves so deep underground in such a way that you might be digging these tunnels out for years now. And that is really significant. So it's not like, oh, the silver bullet is to do X. No, the silver bullet was to deal with this 20 years ago, 25 years ago, not to let it fester and wound. Because how much has Hamas learned with each round of fighting? How much has their strategy become improved as a result of learning how to hide things, how to smuggle things? And that to me is, yeah, if you make a war unwinnable, that's what it becomes, but it doesn't have to be, and it never had to be in that sense. You gave the analogy, or you related this to Afghanistan and Iraq, and I think we should talk about that. But the way I think of it is the analysis we presented from the Institute was essentially a philosophic analysis of the absence of a clear vision for what to do. And it was undercut by the default moral perspective that you have to turn the other cheek. So it was a very powerful, the most powerful military going into a place that could easily eradicate the enemies within it, but choosing not to do that, and thereby creating a quagmire or an unwinnable situation. And that's strongly resembling what Israel has. It's so much more powerful than Hamas, and even more powerful than Hezbollah, despite it being I've read something like Hezbollah is the most powerful non-state military, which is something. That's you can't scoff at that.
Probably is.
Yeah. So, Israel withdrew from that territory in northern Israel 24 years ago, and it's still there. There's still an issue with Hezbollah, and how do you let that fester? So there's two things here. There's the conduct of the war October 7th onward, and then everything that made possible the conflict becoming so much worse, such that you now have a conflict on your hands. And in both cases, I think it's the same kind of ailment. It's a moral philosophic weakness, not primarily a military one. Though I think there have been military problems and fails of intelligence, and we'll get the full picture in due course, but that's not the full explanation here.
No, I mean, you're always going to get failures of intelligence. Those things always happen. Nobody's going to be perfect in terms of that. But you should never be in a position where these things can make a difference. And given Israel's superior military, yeah, there's zero excuses, as you said, for Hezbollah to violate, let's say you go with UN 1701. Well, they've been violating since day one of 1701, and yet Israel's let them get away with that. Hamas has been violating every single condition that's ever been placed on them. They don't care. They never have cared. And so it's the very fact that Israel allowed it and has had several wars with each, right? Or several mini skirmishes with each, and just let them get away with it. Let them ignore it. Is truly stunning in terms of the irresponsibility of it, and you're right, the incapacity, moral incapacity to actually defend yourself and actually go for victory.
I want to build on something you said, which is you were suggesting that there's a common thread with Afghanistan, Iraq, 9/11, and this and I think there definitely is, and that it's worth parking on it for a moment. We were arguing on 9/11 that and since then, what we're facing is not terrorists. What we're facing is not Al-Qaeda only. it's an ideologically driven movement, and it has state sponsors. And this chief state sponsor was Iran. Saudi Arabia is complicit. Pakistan is a major player, and the Taliban regime wasn't clearly a harbor, safe harbor for these people. But the conception of this as an ideological movement, Islamist totalitarian movement, that's a big point we were making for many, many years. And Iran is central to that movement. None of that's changed. That's still true. And what hasn't, I think this is something that I hope people start to piece together and catch up, really, is Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, the militias in Iraq. Iran tells us this is the axis of resistance. Each of the members tells us we're part of the axis of resistance. This is Iran's label for all of its subcontractors and allies. And maybe now, having launched the largest ballistic missile attack in history, and prior to that, a significant drone attack in April, which I think people have conveniently forgotten, maybe now people will come around to, yeah, this isn't really about terrorism. There's something that unites them. What connects this? Now, I'm not fooling myself that they're going to get the whole picture, but I think that is something. It's an opportunity to get people to think there is something in common here, and it's not about the Palestinians. It's not really, and it never really was. It's about imposing an ideological vision, a totalitarian Islamic vision of society everywhere, with Iran spearheading it. This goes to the first issue we talked about, the invasion. Like, this is the biggest point to take away from the Middle East in the last 30, 40 years. And now it's all these factors are being focused on one country, which just so happens to be a free country that is essentially Western in all of its virtues. Maybe there's something to learn here. And I'm being sarcastic, obviously, but that's the story that needs to be told. And this is why it's everybody's war. It's not Israel's war. And it's not only Israel and America in this, it's everybody, because turn this into a nightmare scenario. Imagine that Hamas achieves what it tried to do a year ago. Imagine Iran achieves imagine how this will galvanize. If you thought the Islamic State was an outlier and galvanizing thousands of people to go to the Middle East, imagine what happens when Iran wins, if this nightmare scenario happens. And that's just what is going on here. This is the essence of the issue.
Yeah, and we have to remember that there's no difference between Hamas, Hezbollah, and Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. They're all part of the same movement. They might have some technical disagreements between each other, and ISIS might hate Hezbollah, and Hezbollah might hate ISIS, and they might be fighting. But philosophically, ideologically, in terms of their vision for the future, what they want is world domination and Sharia law, and if they win, that's what they get. That's what we all get. And they play the long game. They think in terms of the long run, and there's a real. I mean, it's real. It's a real threat if the West is weak enough. I mean, I actually think that as weak as the West is, they are even weaker, and therefore the threat is not as big. And in that sense, I do think. Now, I wonder what you think about this. I actually think there is an opportunity here, in spite of Israel's weakness, in spite of America's weakness. It wouldn't take much to topple the Iranian regime.
Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't take much to literally destroy the Islamist cause. I mean, Israel might do it by accident. And it could be a massive victory for anybody who believes in freedom, at least for a while, until the next horrible ideology comes around or horrible actor comes around. But it is possible that this regime could fall, and with it, a lot of the bad guys in the Islamist world would fall with it.
Yeah, I think that is credible to me. And I think that some of the evidence for that is what Israel has managed to do in Lebanon. My view of what they're doing in Lebanon is very different from Gaza in the sense that they made a lot of progress very quickly, including decapitating the leadership, which is a big win. I mean, when's the last? I mean, they managed to get a few Hamas leaders, but that took a long time. And that's a big win. And I agree. If it happens, and it could happen, because if this is Iran's biggest, if this is their biggest play, like, okay, that's it. That doesn't seem like a lot. And Israel's been successful in fending that off. So it's conceivable to me, but I think it would be important if that does happen, as you put it, as sort of by accident, or it would still be important to take the win, which is no one's ever done that. Like, not to take the win in the sense of stopping there, but taking it and saying, we've won, we've defeated you. This is why we did it. And that's a significant step, as opposed to you got a little bit, now go home and be happy with what you got, which is the way that phrase originated with the Biden administration in April. But saying if they manage something like, and it's weird to be talking about this because I don't know that this is actually going to play out, but uh, if the Israelis are able to neutralize Iran's military and its oil and its nuclear facilities, and then the regime starts to fall, maybe they hasten it, maybe the people within Iran decide this is the moment. There will be a lot of work to do to make the moral case, which is to support the Iranians and to declare the regime unworthy of surviving, which is a big part of what I mean by taking the win.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I mean, it could be that Israel and the West win here in some way, and it helps. It buys us a little bit more time. It's not going to be a game changer unless they take the win. It's not going to be a game changer unless the West can identify why it won. What is? Oh, we have better technology. Why do we have better technology? I mean, I don't think 90% of the people know why the West has. Why is Israel richer and more successful and has better technology? I don't think people know and have any conception of that. But if you can take the win, you take the win, I guess. Even if you can't, even if they're not going to acknowledge the source of it.
Yeah, and I'm gonna have to throw some cold water on this because I
Yeah.
think, like, where are we with Afghanistan? Right? It's almost as bad, if not as worse than it was pre 9/11.
Absolutely.
The
Absolutely.
Taliban are totally back, and they're reimposing all the things that all this the uh, cheerleaders told us in 2021 wouldn't ever happen because they're going to be folded into the international community. All that BS. And in that sense, that there has to be some real reckoning. So it's useful to play it as a war game. What happens if it's less credible to me?
I say that I think Iran is different. I think Iran is different because of the goals revolution, I guess. I mean, I think Iran is different because I think they're ready for change. And I think at a superficial level, granted, they recognize that the West is better.
Hmm?
They recognize that that is change they want. And then the question is now, are they willing to fight for it? But I think they are. I mean, they risk their lives to go out into the street. They risk their lives not wearing the hijab. And so Afghanistan was never civilized. It's always been a place of barbarism. I mean, always. Persia, Iran has a history. It's a real place. It's a real civilization. And they're not going to become individual rights respecting, but they could become a lot better than they are today even with what they have today. That's my view. So, and if it does,
Yeah.
it's a shock in the Middle East. It's a game changer in the Middle East in terms of just drying up all the support for the bad guys that is going on.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I think for all the reasons that you say Iran is different, I agree with that. I bring up Afghanistan from the perspective of this could be the kind of place where the remnants of Islamic State, the remnants, so the dead enders find a place they could operate as they did pre 9/11. In that sense, it's you'd have to do some cleanup there as well. It's not like
Yep.
I wasn't thinking that Afghanistan is going to change. It's more about what happens to the resurgent Taliban and the people who would flock there as a refuge.
Yes. No. I think that's right. Um, any sense you have on what's going to happen is um, in terms of the next few weeks is do you have a sense that Israel has more of a backbone these days than it maybe used to have?
I'm speculating here. I don't have
No.
special insight except that I think the wins in Lebanon, I think, can help spur more confidence, because
Mhm.
what happened with Gaza for 9 months, 10 months is it demoralizing. Like, this isn't going anywhere. They still have all the hostages. But if you see what happens, they neutralized a lot of the Hezbollah capabilities in northern. I mean, one of the things that is important to add as context here is that northern Israel, a lot of the towns are ghost towns for a good part of the last year,
80,000
because
people
yeah, because
have
people had to
been back.
evacuate. It was just not safe to live there because of Hezbollah. So that's one of the untold stories here. And so I can see that kind of success breeding more confidence. And the real question is, what is Israel going to do in response to the Iranian attack? Could that be the tipping point in terms of its becoming more self-assertive in the right way? And we'll see how that plays out.
Every day that passes and they haven't done something, I'm less convinced that
Mhm.
anything significant will happen.
Right.
Um, so I was just in Israel, and one of the things that's obvious and that a majority of people hold in Israel today is that the most important thing to do in Gaza is get the hostages out and get the hostages no matter what. I mean, I don't think this is a minority in Israel. It's not leftist. I think this is a majority view. And I gave a talk in Israel and I said something like, as non-diplomatic as I am, and this was in Sderot. So this is in the south of Israel. This is in the area where the hostages were taken from. This is probably people in the audience who know some of the people who are hostages. I said, you got to assume they're dead. Rescue who you can, and you've got to defeat Hamas. That is the only priority. And I mean, people were very upset. There's a whole article in one of the Israeli newspapers about what a horrible person I am. Um, I mean, what's your view what's your view of how to deal with a hostage? I mean, this is an atypical hostage situation where you got 200 plus people taken hostage originally.
Yeah, I have the same view as you do, which is that the more you prioritize rescuing of the hostages, as desirable as that is, the more it distracts you from the primary goal, which is to eliminate this threat forever. And why did they take hostages? And it's useful to think about the place of hostages in the history of this conflict. So the uh, probably best known case was I think it's Hezbollah, took Gilad Shalit.
That
There's a
was
really
Hamas. That was Hamas.
Hamas. Yeah, that's right. But Hezbollah, that's right. So
Hezbollah
they,
that took two other guys another time,
yeah, but
negotiated as well.
Hezbollah has the record of taking Western hostages as well. So we can come back to that. But just as a strategy, so you're right. It was Hamas, and they held him for 5 years. And how many in the Israeli policy was they made a deal to get, now this wasn't in the context of an ongoing fight the way this is, but they traded him to get him out, and they released 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. At least some of them were prisoners, including one of what is now Hamas's leader, whose strategy, whose takeaway while he was in prison was, we should take more hostages. This is a good strategy for us. Now, for 1 to 1,000 was the ratio. And Israel has also traded living prisoners for the bodies of Israeli prisoners. Now, you have to understand that context, because I think that's part of what explains the reaction that you got to your argument. Because I think your argument is right. It's like it's a war, and you have to just assume that you would do everything you can to free them. But if you make that the point, you're giving them the advantage that they sought by taking the hostages. Like, this was not an accidental feature of the conflict on October 7th. So what do I think they will do? I think this is one more way in which Israel is playing into the Hamas advantage, which is Hamas figures this out, takes as many prisoners as it could, and is going to keep holding them until the last man that they can, because they know this is both a shield, it's leverage, and it prolongs the destruction of Israel's reputation, its moral reputation, because you're going to in the same way that they use their own people as sacrificial offerings, and they want this. This is exactly what they're. So just tactically, it is. I think it's hard to say, but it's the wrong priority. As much as they should be freed.
Yeah, it's a horrible issue to have to deal with because obviously we all want them to be free.
Mhm.
On the other hand, if you negotiate with terrorists, we know the consequence. The consequence is always bad, and there's no good way around it. And giving into the terrorists only leads to more disasters. And it's amazing to me that people just don't learn. But there is the flip side of this is Israel betrayed these people.
Mhm. Mhm.
These people shouldn't have been taken hostage. The 1,200 shouldn't have died. This government betrayed them. They betrayed them by not securing them beforehand. Everything that you said before about how did they build these tunnels and how did they get these arms and how did they get so strong? Why didn't Israel do anything about it? That's the essence. I mean, there is a massive betrayal here by the Israeli government of the people who are all being victims of what happened on October 7th.
Yeah, I agree with that. And so I mean, part of what makes this difficult is what you're saying is that the responsibility of the government is to free them. But how do you do that? Do you make a deal with Hamas, or do you destroy Hamas and do it in such a way that you can expedite the liberation of these people, which should be a goal? It's just the argument is
Yep.
if you
Absolutely.
prioritize this, then how are you going to get rid of the problem? And I'm open to being convinced that there's a better way to do this. I mean, I think it takes some thinking about what you're facing here, but from everything I've gathered, they've put them in tunnels because they're using them in part as bargaining chips and in part as human shields. And they're not just any human shield, right? They're your own people, as opposed to the Palestinians, which you could put a different spin, sort of a different status to. So yeah, I think it's a
Yeah,
very
I don't
gruesome
think there's another
strategy.
way, unfortunately. I think it's this is the way. But the part of what's frustrating, I think, is the fact that the politicians responsible for getting us into this mess are taking no personal responsibility for it. And Netanyahu, the government, there might be conflict within the government. These people might be less popular, more popular. But the sheer scale of the failure, not on that day, but in the decades leading up to that day, nobody's talking about that. You go to Israel and nobody is talking about that. And it was the same thing. Nobody talked, if you remember, after 9/11, nobody talked about the fact that Clinton could have got bin Laden and Bush could have got bin Laden, and in Israel it's 10 times worse because the threat was so much realer, and the opportunities to solve this issue happen were so often. So let's see what we did the. So where do you think this all goes from here? Let's say we're sitting here a year from now and talking about this. Um, what are kind of the scenarios that could play out? Actually, before that, I knew there was something I want to ask you. Um, what do you make of the Biden administration's, and not just the Biden, but the world, escalation, escalation, escalation? That would drives me nuts, right? Don't escalate, don't escalate, don't escalate. And now these rumors about Biden trying to how to deal with Israel. We'll give you aid, we'll give you help, we'll give you all this. Just don't attack Iran. And just the sheer scale of Western appeasement.
Yeah, it's demoralizing, I have to say. It's the idea, first of all, escalation. What is it really trying to capture? And I have a view that the way war is understood is it's warped. It's not true to the facts, and it's not true to the kind of moral considerations that should come into it. So think about the April attack from Iran. And there was the same kind of thing. Don't escalate. We hope that Iran's signaling they don't escalate, so don't attack them too hard. And Israel, they attacked a few targets, and they made it clear we're not going any further than this. And it's a pretense that it's a war and not a war. And the idea of escalation is like, well, are you turning a dial, or are you trying to defeat an enemy? And if you're turning a dial, then it's conflict management, which is part of what got Israel to where it is with the Palestinians, where it is with Iran, where it is with Hezbollah. Conflict management is not the right direction to take here. And that's where I think the escalation frame puts you. I wish I mean, if we were to borrow that term, because I don't really use it in my thinking and when I comment on this, I don't find it helpful. But if you were to borrow it, what does it really mean? It means go after them more assertively, go after them more aggressively. And you can imagine it's 1939, and what do we do? Do we escalate, or do we try to you go to war? 1942 and then the Pearl Harbor. What do? Do you go to war and try to defeat the enemy and do everything necessary to do that at the least cost to your people? Or do you treat it like a dial that you go up and down? Now, there's particular skirmishes, particular battles where you assess how much force you need to accomplish the goals. But that can't be your view of the whole conflict. The whole conflict has to have one clear goal, and that is the defeat of the enemy. And if you don't have that, if you can't justify it, don't go to war, don't get into it. And I think this is the one of the symptoms of the decay that we're living in intellectually, is that you can have, they just fired almost 200 rockets at you, and just so happens that your technology saved you, because imagine how many people would have died absent that missile defense system in Israel. And your reaction to that is, well, don't go back too hard. What do you think is going to happen next if you don't go back hard and eliminate the threat completely? So it's the wrong way to think about the conflict, and it's trying to mask the reality of the situation. I think it's partly rationalization that we don't really want to admit that there's a war, but there is, and the more you admit there isn't, the worse it's going to be for you.
Yeah, what's needed is escalation, as you say. I mean, what's needed is to actually know who the enemy is and to destroy it. And American political leadership seems to be completely incapable of thinking in those terms. And we saw that after 9/11. So it's not surprising they're projecting that onto Israel itself.
I think some of what comes into this context is what's the argument for the don't escalate analysis? It's, well, we don't want this to become a bigger Middle East conflict. We don't want this to become a regional war. The region's on the, what do you think the region is like on a random Tuesday? I mean, that analysis of
what's going on. This is a war with Iran. It's
Yeah.
been a war with Iran since 1979. It's the refusal to actually see there is a regional conflict. There's something to ask. I mean, if you say, okay, it could turn into a world war, Russia and China might intervene. Okay, then I can at least see, what you're concerned about. But nobody takes that seriously. Nobody thinks that's real.
Yeah, and I think some of that catastrophizing view comes from just not feeling confident in understanding what is actually shaping the Middle East. I'm very dubious that Russia or China, as much as they have alliances with some of these, that they really want to get involved in this, is not to their advantage. And Russia's tied up in Ukraine. The Chinese are not the ones to get into something like this, based on the things I've learned about China. So to me, it's partly to scare themselves and to scare others from being assertive, and it's wrapped up with this. If you're self-confident and if you're self-assertive and achieve your own ends, it's going to be catastrophic. So it's colored by a moral perspective that self-interest is inherently
Yeah.
self-destructive. And
Yep.
it's just, if you translate it, if you essentialize it and translate it, well, where is this coming from? Like, when has it been true that if you defeat your enemy, it comes back at you harder? That's just not true. That's the whole point of defeat, is that you end the threat. And yet they can't, and I think it's a combination of that. They can't think in terms of what the outcome should be. And every moral fiber of every influence they've had from moral thinking that's sort of colored by self-sacrifice tells them that assertiveness is inherently bad and self-destructive. And so they come up with this whole view that just it's yes, it could blow up, but why would you think that? I think it's in significant part because you don't think anyone has a right to assert themselves. Bad things will happen if you do. I don't think that's
And
well founded.
it's exactly the opposite. I mean, if the West actually stood up and defended itself in this case, then it's less likely that China would invade Taiwan. It's less likely that Russia gets involved. And indeed, in this, Russia and China both have their own Islamist problems. It's unlikely that they rush to the defense of an Islamist regime, an Islamist.
Yeah.
So going back to where you think we're going to be in, is there is there any cause for optimism here in the short run, right? Because in the long run, we know what it's going to take, but in the short run, is there any reason to be optimistic?
Again, with the hard questions, you saved them up.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
would reiterate the point I made about the gains seen in Lebanon. I think success can really breed success and confidence, and that to me is it's if you think about Israel at its peak in terms of military strength and ingenuity and the legendary stories that you hear about, the bravery, that's some of what we saw in the last month with the response to Hezbollah. And also some of the things they did on Iranian soil by killing, I think it was Ismail Haniyeh, I forget. It was inside a compound run by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Okay, that is the kind of thing that the more you can feel like we can do this, it's not just you're sending a message to the enemy, it's no, we can actually win if we know how to do it. So my hope is that is the beginning of something that grows and points in the right direction. It's hard to be more positive than that. For me.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think while we're negative on Gaza, you can't be negative on. I mean, I don't think one should be negative on, the sheer ability of the Israeli military to defeat the enemy and take minimal casualties. I mean, I remember all these military experts. I make fun of them all the time on my show because this is the de-escalation, right? Can't go into Gaza. If you go into Gaza, thousands of Israelis will die. It's urban warfare. There's a massive overestimation of the power of evil, which is a philosophical, I think, issue. And they always think the bad guys are so much more competent, so much more able, so much. And so you can't go into Rafah. If you go into Rafah, Israelis will die. It'll be awful. I mean, militarily, it was not an issue. And it's more an issue of how they went in, and they let them all escape. They let them all get away. They're not going in to win. But even at the minimum level they're doing, they're good at what they do. And the bad guys are bad at what they do. And the only reason they are somewhat made possible, somewhat, hold out is because Israel's not willing to go all out, and the West won't allow them or won't tolerate it. All right, I'm going to ask you a political question. Do you see any difference, or do you think that the response to Israel would be different under a Republican administration than under the current administration? I mean, the current administration, particularly now, is wimpy but maybe before the election because they want to appease the Arab vote. I don't know exactly, but they become even wimpier the more time goes by. Their altruism maybe comes to the forefront more. Would the Republican administration be any different in your view?
I have two answers. One is the conventional Republican, which isn't running for office. What would that look like?
I mean, if
Yeah.
Nikki Haley, I mean,
Yeah.
Life would be so different if Nikki Haley
Yeah.
was the Republican nominee right now.
I think a conventional Republican would be
Yeah.
pretty similar, but maybe the rhetoric would be stronger. I mean, that's if you think about an analog to that is the 2006 Hezbollah war, which was 50 days. It was pretty significant. That was under Bush, and that was the tail end of the forward strategy of freedom. They'd essentially given up on that vision, at
Yeah.
least in reality. So I don't think it would have been significantly different. I don't know exactly what to expect from a Trump administration if that's the contrast position, partly because I don't know what would be the trigger of the moment for Trump and what he would say. Now, he said certain things that make me think it wouldn't really be as pro-Israel as many people wish it would. Like, Trump has a reputation in many circles as having done a lot of good things for Israel. And I think at a concrete level, there were symbolic gains and they were good. What would it look like in a conflict like right now? Well, the one thing he said earlier in the last year or so was it was equivocal. It was they need to get this done because look what's happening to their reputation. It was something along those lines. It was not you've got a right to win. It's like it's harming you. Like you don't want to be in this sort of PR mess. And it was really unprincipled. And so given everything we know about Trump in the past and how erratic and arbitrary he can be and the kind of things he likes to do, like he left the Iran nuclear deal. Yes, that was a really good deal to leave because it was a terrible deal. Why did Trump leave it? It was the wrong deal. Like he could have got a better deal. Like we got screwed. Obama, okay. And then some days it's, well, no, Iran is a terrible country. It's evil. Is it okay? Which one is true? Is it that we could have got a better deal, or is it Iran is the source of all evil in the Middle East? Like you have to decide what you actually think. So I'm reluctant to say I think it would be markedly better either way.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
reasons
I
to
also
worry
think,
that it'd be more erratic and potentially
yep.
out of control under Trump because we've seen so many things he's done during emergencies like COVID that okay, this is not someone you want in power when there's a crisis on your hands.
Yeah.
And I
And he
should
did
say,
have,
let me just say, Yaron, since I don't
yeah.
know that you have to have this, but I'm speaking now as an employee
Yes.
of the institute. But
Right.
the institute is not we don't take positions on candidates. Nothing that I say should be understood as supporting or opposing a candidate. And I'm speaking here just in terms of an analysis of the philosophic issues that animate the different parties on this issue.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think my view is a lot of what determines what Trump will do is who are the people around him because he's an empty vessel. I don't think there's anything there. And he had decent people around him last time, whether it was Mattis or Kelly. I mean, not people we would support. I criticized at the time dramatically, but relatively speaking, decent people. Bolton at some point, who I think is one of the better people in foreign policy. And none of those people, none of those people are going to be in a future administration. And so who are those going to be? And then he had Kushner, his son-in-law, who, again, I'm very mixed about, but on Israel is pretty good and just wrote a piece. I don't know if you saw this. He wrote a piece on Israel that was, it was, given conventional, it was not bad. But Kushner's not going to be there. Kushner's making too much money. So I just don't. It's impossible to say what Trump would do. I don't think Trump knows what he would do. I don't think anybody knows what he would do. It depends on who's going to be around him in that setting. All right. If you've got time, do you want to take a few questions?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. David from Costa Rica. Thanks, David. Why are Jewish people always labeled as capitalists? Israel was founded by socialists. The Bolsheviks included many like Trotsky. If one looks at the greatest capitalists of the Industrial Revolution, they were mostly Gentiles, Rockefeller, Morgan, Ford, etc. So why this association of Jews with capitalism?
Well, a big part of it is that Jews were financiers, and capitalism needs financiers. They're integral to the growth of any economy. And a reason many Jews were concentrated in that industry as a result of persecution and limited career options. And so they went into banking and other forms of finance. So that there's that kind of association, and that goes to the heart of what capitalism is about. It's money, and you've done a lot of work on this in terms of what finance's reputation has been through history. Think of Shylock in Merchant of Venice. That it goes back a long way, and obviously that's pre-industrial capitalism, but that is an echo through the way people think about capitalism through to today.
Yeah, let's just say that Jews have capitalized on capitalism in a way that many other peoples have not. They've been very, if you think about the Jews who came to America, they were ignorant. They had nothing when they came. I mean, people think today about Jews as successful. But they came to America with nothing. And they came from backward place, Russia and Eastern Europe, where they lived in little villages in the middle of nowhere. And they succeeded tremendously. They did very, very well. And yes, maybe they're not Rockefeller, Morgan, Ford, but they own a lot of businesses. They became business people. They became bankers. And they've done very, very well. It's also true that Marx made the link between Jews and capitalism. And he did that, maybe his first published essay was an essay written that's called On the Jewish Question. And on the Jewish question, it's an essay worth reading because you get a lot of flavor for Marx in that essay. It's on Marxism.org if you're curious. It's available for free. And he makes the link between Jews, capitalism, and egoism. He talks about selfishness, and he talks about Jews being selfish. And it's related to the 19th century, both them turning into bankers. So bankers, the whole idea of money off of money seems like the most greedy thing possible. But also the success European Jews are having in the 19th century, particularly in Western Europe, as business people, as merchants. Jews were always merchants, middlemen. In Marx, there's no role for middlemen. Like the middleman disappears. You've got workers who create stuff. You've got customers who get the stuff. That's it. There's no middleman. So Jews are middlemen. They're merchants. That's capitalist. That's, again, selfish. That's profit-seeking. So in the left, that's really, Marx is really, I think, responsible for a lot of this view of the association of Jews with that. Anyway, so that's some of the history. David also asks, in a two-state solution, is a two-state solution even possible? One of the negotiating partners refuses to respect the right to exist of the other. Why does the West ignore this fact?
Well, it's a long involved answer to that. There is no viable two-state solution. It's been tried repeatedly. We're seeing in Gaza and in the West Bank the bitter fruit of what a two-state solution looks like, which is exactly that. You can't coexist alongside people who want a state whose purpose is to launch a war against its own people and against its neighbors, which is exactly what the Palestinian cause has done, is just create one warlike state after another. Why do people not understand that, or the people advocating this? I think we started the conversation by talking about the scale of evasion around this conflict, and I mean that in the moral sense of it's wrong to disregard the facts. It's wrong to tell yourself a story that isn't true, because it disconnects you from reality and it causes problems at every step. That is at the highest level what has happened, and what's interesting to ask is, why has there been so much evasion about the nature of the Palestinian movement across decades? And I think that is a story that one has to look at from the perspective that I think Ayn Rand brings, which is you have to understand the role of philosophic ideas. And the Palestinians both embodied the idea of the underdog victim, the suffering, long-suffering group to whom all sacrifices must be delivered. And so the morality of altruism divides the world into those who have produced values and those who are destined to be given those values as sacrifice. So there's the givers and the takers, or the producers and the beneficiaries, or the profiteers on sacrifice. And the Palestinians are both seen as the victims, and they know themselves to be able to profiteer on it. And so there's both elements of this. the Westerners want to see them this way, and the Palestinians are good at positioning themselves this way. And it was a partly conscious goal of leveraging that. So that's still a short answer to a deeper question. And one of the things I would say to that is, you might find, if you haven't read my book, What Justice Demands, you might find it interesting because I go through the history of the Palestinian movement, how it's changed over time, and how it's been understood. Looking at that can help you piece together some of why there's such disregard for what should be better understood.
Yeah. By the way, David says he has read your book and he loved What Justice
Okay,
Demands.
good. So that's for others' benefit. I'm glad I've mentioned it, but thanks for that comment,
I mean,
David.
I just say my view on the two-state solution is I mean, what does it mean possible? In what world, right? In the world in which we live, where the Palestinians hold what they believe, no, but no solution is possible other than the defeat and them changing their minds. With their current views, I was talking to Einat Wilf, who's a big defender of, and she framed the Israeli-Palestinian issue as, you've got one side that wants to kill you. And what are you supposed to negotiate exactly? I mean, there's no solution. They want to kill you. What's the compromise? They get two legs, but they don't want two legs. They want to kill you. They want you dead. And so there's no deal. There's no negotiating. There's nothing to be done with the Palestinians other than defeat them in this context. Because they only want the destruction of Israel. They want to kill you. There's nothing else they want. And the West deludes itself and is evasive, constantly evading that fact. Now, why they evade that, I think Elan's right. It's the fundamental altruism. And they also try to imagine that evil like that doesn't exist. That, the evil of somebody saying, no, I don't care about me. I just want to kill you. I think the West kind of tries to evade the existence of that, because if they recognized it, they'd have to do something about it.
Let me add I agree with that as well. Let me add something that might be useful to David. So, and others listening, this is a point that, again, I take it's based on my understanding of Ayn Rand and her deep analysis of the dynamic around altruism, not just the identity of it, what it actually means and how it manifests, but just that there's a certain psychological, moral dynamic, which is, it's very hard to think I have to sacrifice for evil. Like, these people really want to kill me and I have to sacrifice for them. That's what the good is. And what happens is that it's hard to swallow that. Any good person who's trying to be good will say, well, I can't really face this. And so altruism fosters in you the need to tell yourself that they're not really that bad. And this is the whitewashing that comes in. And altruism is like a power tool for whitewashing, moral whitewashing. And why is that? Because the more you want to comply with it, the more you have to support the people who want to destroy you, and people who aren't good, and people who aren't worthy, because worthiness is not a consideration you have any right to consider. It's just off the table. And this is something dramatized in Atlas Shrugged on a massive scale. So this is part of the different levels of responsibility. This is what you have to look for in the policy and in the thinking around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and why the two-state solution is such a shibboleth. It's like it's a sacred cow. Like, if you don't if you don't say you're for the two-state solution, you're crazy and animal and barbarous. Well, why is that? Because that makes it helps to reinforce this rationalization that really they're just upset because they didn't get a state 75 years ago. And that's the whole story. We don't want to face the fact that they teach their children to murder, that they think martyrdom is good, that blowing up people in pizzerias is right. We don't want to face all that. Those are just the so-called extremists. And notice that's another tool for rationalization, for the fact that, no, they're not in any sense outliers. They're the people who embody this ideology in full extent. It's not like they're going off the rails. This is what it means. Everyone else is a compromiser, and what you want to believe, what the rationalization is trying to make you accept is, no, I'm really just concerned with the people who somehow have some legitimate grievance against Israel. And that's just not true, because insofar as you can find people like that, and I think there are people like that, it's a tiny minority, and they're not central to the movement. The movement exploits that. So when you think about altruism's role, it's not merely in how people think of their duty to sacrifice, or even the way in which the Palestinians have exploited it in numerous ways. It's useful to think about the moral psychological aspect, which is that the need to tell yourself that what you're dealing with is not as bad as it actually is. And that's the way in which altruism fosters that kind of evasion. And again, this is not an original thought with me. Another place to look for this is one of my colleagues is working on an article for our journal New Ideal about the American support in the 1920s to the Soviet Union. And it's a replay of this, because they didn't want to face the reality that the Soviets were as evil as they were. And so they just made up stories for themselves that there's some benefit to us. They're not as bad as you think. They can't possibly take seriously the ideas that they hold. And again, that is the crucial thing to understand here in why it is that we keep this whole policy of a two-state solution is still around. Like, it has no basis in reality, but it's a useful tool for pretending that what you're dealing with is not as bad as what you're dealing with.
Well, and it's manifest right now in the fact that this war is a war against Hamas,
Exactly.
when it should be a war against the Palestinians, right? So you pretend that Hamas is somehow distinct from the Palestinians, different from them, doesn't represent. It's just a small number of people. And then you see them celebrating every missile attack. You see all the Palestinians celebrating 10/7. You see all of that, and people just go blank. They completely evade that fact. They don't know what they're doing. I mean, the whole war would have a completely different perspective if this was a war against, call it Gazans, people who live in Gaza, or Palestinians more broadly. But Israel cannot bring themselves to actually saying that for exactly the reasons you said. All right, Wes says, big fan of your work, Elan. Thank you.
Thank you,
Wes.
It's good to hear.
That was
Thank
very,
you.
very generous. Let's see. Pickaxing on Europa. He says, I try to promote Iran to friends on Israel. Friends called you a cult leader and sent me this philosophy video, a critique of Rand through the caricature of a dystopian video game, BioShock, a narrative of real shame. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of haters out there, find Rand. It's very difficult to get past that. It is sad. And BioShock it has been a mixed thing. I mean, a lot of people discovered Ayn Rand because of BioShock, so that's good. But a lot of people use BioShock as if it's actual description of objectivism, which is bizarre. EL says, how did the Gulf War and President George H.W. Bush's policy shape U.S. foreign policy in the long run? So this is the 91 Gulf War. You giving us any thought?
Yeah. Well, one thing you could point to is the conduct of that war was a template for what came later, which was it wasn't the right war to have. Like, liberating Kuwait was not a U.S. priority. It's good if you did it for the sake of the oil, but that wasn't right to liberate Kuwait. And they decided to hold back from removing Saddam, and Saddam was still in power. So there's bad things that came of that war. I would say that what HW represents is the epitome of pragmatism in foreign policy. So it was under his tenure that we got the beginnings of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. It was seen as this is the thing to push. So that was inaugurated during his tenure. And the other big story is Iran puts a bounty on the head of Salman Rushdie, during H.W. Bush's administration. And what does he have to say against that? Nothing. It's like, yeah, maybe this wasn't a good thing to write in the first place. That's not ruffle feathers. And this is Iran. This is 10 years after the embassy siege. So it's in all the ways you would expect. It's unprincipled, and it sets us on a bad direction, both with respect to Iran, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and Iraq. Now, again, it's not that I have some view that Iraq was a priority and the Gulf War was a necessity. Not at all. But if you took it as we went to war, well, this is not the way to conduct it. And that's just set. And and all of this is in the context of it's the Cold War has just ended. There is no power on the face of the planet that is even close to equal to the United States. So there's a moment that a lot of people at the time were looking at and saying, this is a huge opportunity. We get to do so many things. We have so much influence over the rest of the world. And what does Bush do? He doesn't take it seriously, and this is where we land, where he sets us in motion. I don't think other than those catastrophic kind of decisions, I don't think he was consequential in a positive way.
No, I think that's right. I mean, it did show the war showed, the Gulf War showed just the gap in terms of the American superiority militarily over the rest of the world. I remember again in 91, there were these military experts that came on TV and said, oh, it's going to be a tough war. Iraq has this massive army. They're really strong. They're experienced. They've fought a war with the Iranians. They've got a lot of experience. And I remember laughing and thinking, they have old Soviet equipment. They're going to be wiped out in days. And they were. Most American casualties in that war were friendly fire. The Iraqis could do nothing against the Americans. And it was all squandered. That is, they showed the world, look how powerful we are. And what came of it? No, nothing. It was it was wasted. I guess Kuwait gets their own country, but who cares? And it made it murky what American interests are, what that represents, what that means, and when military force should be used. And then, of course, it also, we don't win, which is a continuation of Vietnam or Korea. We can fight, we can defeat the enemy, we're superior to them militarily, dramatically, but we're not going to win. We don't have actually goals of winning.
I'm going to take one.
Yeah.
I'm going to take one more question, then I have to drop you off.
Sounds good. Marilyn says, she says, not escalating means just accepting the 60,000 displaced people in the northern Israel who can't return to their homes because of Hezbollah. What the hell? The hell is right. Okay. Let me find a good question there for the end. All right, let's see. I will note, Michael notes that Super Chat. So YouTube curates the Super Chat. There's certain words you can write. They won't let you write. And he said, Super Chat is being particularly ridiculous today with not letting me ask questions. Forgive the misspellings. It's the only way I can get anything through. But this has been going on for a long time. But it's so Michael writes, that is interesting, Michael, but I don't know how YouTube does. I guess if they've got an AI algorithm that says certain words are not allowed in the super chat and it kind of polices it. He says if Bibi had any balls, he would have struck Iran. You can't write Iran. So he had to misspell Iran hard today on anniversary of 10/7 could have even gotten him reelected. Yeah, I mean, the election are far off, so who knows what'll happen between 9 elections. Okay, we're going to let Elan go. I'll answer the remaining questions. Thanks, Elan. Really appreciate this. I appreciate all the work you do on these topics and, of course, everything else. And we'll see you back here soon, hopefully.
Good. Thanks for having me. It's great. I'm glad to have the conversation, and thanks for all the questions and the support. Appreciate it.
Oh, and I do recommend yesterday, Elan, and not yesterday, today it was released. Elan and Onkar talked about 10/7 on the Ayn Rand Institute YouTube channel. You guys should all check that out.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
Bye, Elan. All right, let's see. I see there's a question from Morandi, and it says 5,000, and I'm going, whoa, that's a lot of money. And then you look, and it's 5,000 Argentinian pesos, which are worth less than $5. But here's the question. In the post-9/11 era, were you in agreement with objectivist Juan Pizarro when he argued that the U.S. should bomb Arab nations, even using nukes, return Western-owned oil companies to their rightful owners, and play a mercenary role in the oil companies if the oil companies agreed to pay for protection? He also said the U.S. should isolate, colonize, and settle the lands. No, I don't agree with that. I see no reason to colonize and settle lands and have troops all over the world having to deal with Islamist fanatics everywhere. It just is. That strikes me as sacrificial. It strikes me as a massive waste of American funds and soldiers and blood and so on. I have no problem with using nukes if the occasion necessitates it, and if you can win faster, better. But I was very clear after 9/11, and I don't think after 9/11 it was necessary to retake the oil fields and all of that. I think it was very simple. Basically, Afghanistan needed to be destroyed. The Taliban and Al Qaeda needed to be destroyed within days of 9/11. That should have happened. It should have happened from the air, using whatever means necessary. Bin Laden should have died in the hours, days after 9/11. It shouldn't have taken years to happen. And they had him on several occasions. They didn't shoot because of fear of civilian casualties, as usual. So I'd say the first step should have been, you've got to just devastate Afghanistan. I don't think that required taking the country over, occupying it, staying there for years. I think that was a mission for a few weeks, a few months, primarily from the air, but with whatever ground troops were necessary. For example, when he was in Bora Bora, it should have been Marines surrounding Bora Bora, not Afghan tribes who let him sneak out and sneak into Pakistan. So, yeah, I mean, Afghanistan should have taken weeks or months, no more than that. And the entire Taliban leadership should have been taken out together with the Al Qaeda leadership. And then step two should have been basically the creation of a list of all the organizations and all the countries inspired, committed to Islamic totalitarianism. And that list, at the top of that list, would have been Iran. And Iran should have been, the regime in Iran should have been destroyed. Its leadership should have been killed. Again, minimize ground troops. I said at the time, America should provide Iran with the infrastructure its philosophy deserves. In other words, from the air, the United States could have destroyed every power plant, every oil field, every bridge, every industrial facility, and taking them back to the dark ages, which is what their philosophy deserves. Then I think once you do that, you turn to Saudi Arabia and you say to the Saudis, look, you've got two options. We can do to you what we just did to Iran, or you can dismantle all of the infrastructure within your country that supports the Islamists. The Wahhabis have to go, and every one of the charities that fund terrorism, the family members who are funding terrorism, they all need to go. And if not, then we will come and we'll do to you what we did to Iran. And at the same time, the Americans should have turned to Israel and said, not only do you have a green light to take out Hamas and Hezbollah, which are cousins of our brothers and cousins of ISIS, of not ISIS in those days, Al Qaeda, but we will support you in any way we can. Go get them and destroy them. And here's a list, by the way, Islamic Jihad, a list of all the Islamist organizations, all those committed all of them need to be destroyed, every single one of them. And Israel, whatever you can do, great. We'll take on the rest. And the United States has just systematically gone after every Islamist terrorist organization on the planet and destroyed them. By the way, the same thing it did to Saudi, in other ways it could have done, should have done to Pakistan. Pakistan, of course, has nukes. You have to be careful there. But it should have been made clear to Pakistan that their support for the Taliban and Al-Qaeda was noticed and would never be permitted again, that they better shape up, they better shut down the madrasas, they better eliminate the terrorist organizations that were in Pakistan. We know bin Laden ultimately hid there forever. So it involved taking out two countries, Afghanistan and Iran, never touching Iraq. Iraq was not an issue, not a threat, had nothing to do with 9/11, had nothing to do with the Islamic totalitarian threat against America or the West. And it had everything to do with Iran and then secondarily Saudi Arabia and the complete destruction of the Islamist terrorist organizations all around the world. And then at that point, who cares who owns the oil fields? I mean, the point is that if they're behaving, if they're playing by the rules of trade, then it doesn't really matter at that point. So that's what I would have done. I don't think nukes would have been necessary. There are all kinds of complications with nukes, radiation, and just the risk of getting the Russians or the Chinese involved or whatever. Nukes should be an option, and in some cases, maybe they are the best option. But it's not like you do something bad, we nuke you. I mean, they're very. There's some real consequences to using nuclear bombs. Radiation is a big one. The health effects long term, also one. So they should be used very, very selectively if they're going to be used. You could have taken out Iran, Afghanistan, anybody in the Middle East without any nukes, pretty cheaply and pretty easily. So that would be what I did. I disagreed with Juan Pizarro. I don't think he has any real knowledge of what a war is like and what it would be like to be on the ground in the Middle East and what it would take to occupy these places and colonize them and what the costs involved. And I mean, it's just fantasy. It's a fantasy land. And it's particularly fantasy land in the world in which we live, but it's a fantasy land even in a kind of ideal world. It's a fantasy land. Why would you ever do that? Why would you sacrifice the blood and treasure in order to achieve that? All right, Michael, does Israel not have any ballistic missiles to counter Iran? It does. It has lots of ballistic missiles. It just doesn't use them because I think it's much more effective in terms of targeting and in terms of payload and everything else to use airplanes. Israel, for the most part, has mastered the ability of not being susceptible to air defense systems. Israel's been able to operate in the air over Syria, over Lebanon, over Hamas, over Gaza, of course, but even over Iraq, without really having to worry about air defense systems of the enemy. So airplanes delivering payloads has been the chosen method of the Israelis. But Israel has ballistic missiles. Israel has ballistic missiles that can reach Moscow. They can reach most of Europe. They can reach all of the Middle East. They have ranges of I think up to 5,000 kilometers. So what you call medium range or long range, but not intercontinental missiles. So Israel has probably 5 different types of ballistic missiles available to them. One of them, God, I forget the name now. Something 3 is the long range one, which again can reach Moscow. So it's just a choice, and I don't know all the factors that went into making that choice. that Israel has made to primarily use its air force and not use ballistic missiles in attacking Iran or Lebanon, and Gaza's too close by. By the way, we are still short of our second hour's goal. We've only got 10 minutes to get, for the second hour, and we're short about $130 to get to our goal for the second hour. So please consider supporting the show with a sticker. You can do $1, $2, $5. Andy just did $5 sticker. Thank you, Andy. You can also ask a question for any amount of money, although, of course, $20, $50, $100 questions are prioritized because that gets us faster to the goal. But you can also ask questions for 5, 10, 20 as well. Subaquatic says, so as not to hurt civilians, they don't use ballistic missiles. They're pretty accurate ballistic missiles that can target, can thread a target from within less than 3 meters. So they're very accurate ballistic missiles. I think they're more expensive than the bombs they have. Arrow, thank you, the Arrow missile system. They have Arrow 2 and Arrow 3. Arrow 3 is the one that has the longer distance. But they're very accurate, but they might be more expensive. And again, I think they can deliver more accurate payload from airplanes. But why they never use any ballistic missiles, and I haven't seen them use them at all, I really don't know. I'm not sure why. And they have the Arrow system, but they also have other systems. They have a array of different ballistic missiles at their disposal. Michael says, did you see Norman Finkelstein's debate with former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett? No, I didn't. It's too bad Naftali Bennett actually debated him. I mean, Finkelstein should not be debated. He is really beneath contempt. But I have not seen it. I'm actually interested because I'm interested in Bennett more than I'm interested in Finkelstein. So how did he do? Did he do well? Did he do well? Enric, the left confusing people through accusations by inversion of racism, move to calling Israel Nazi. The inversion needs to be confronted. Yes, I think that they are, they learned from the Russians. The Russians called the Ukrainian Nazis, including the Jewish, I guess, president of Ukraine. When the Russians were the ones actually acting like Nazis, they were the aggressors. And I think the left has learned from that, or maybe Putin learned from the left. But this is a common tactic of authoritarians or the irrational. It's to latch on to kind of what the culture already accepts as evil, and then just label your enemies as that which the culture already accepts as evil, and keep labeling them of that. And who cares about the historical or actual meaning of the concept? You just use it, repeat, and it sticks in the end. And yes, it should be counted, absolutely. Jacob says, before October 8th, I dreamed of Aliyah. Now I'm scared. War, terror, weak, afraid government. Will there ever be peace? I mean, there might be. Again, I think that we very much could get it accidentally. That is, Israel could, without intending it, without really realizing what it's doing, could tip the balance in Iran and bring the downfall of that regime. I wish they did it consciously and put in the effort, but it's quite possible that if there's enough confrontation between Israel and Iran, that regime will topple. And if the Iranian regime topples, Israel and Saudi Arabia will sign a peace deal. Nobody will really care anymore about Palestinians. Maybe then the Palestinians will start caring about themselves and figure out what to do and how to deal with this. One thing Israel could do, here's a thought. Israel could blow up the fence between Gaza and Egypt and allow the Palestinians to run into Egypt and then make the Egyptians choose between shooting the Palestinians or letting them in. And that would be one way they could reduce the pressure of that civilian population in Gaza itself. They could also hire boats and lease them out to the Gazans and say, sail any way you want, just not to our shores, and let the Northern Africans or even the Europeans have to deal with the migrations of Gazans out. That would be one way to relieve the kind of pressure. There are lots of things that can be done, but certainly the downfall of the Iranian regime would be a monumental event in the Middle East and could bring about a more peaceful existence, at least for a while. Thank you, Jacob. Frank, thank you. $100. Really, really appreciate it. Frank has basically bought us to Target. Thank you. He says, always appreciated. Always appreciated from me to you as well. Thank you. Justin, will Trump protect the Jewish people? No, and the Jewish people who call themselves Jews shouldn't be dependent on Trump to protect them. I mean, they should protect themselves. Trump will do whatever, I don't know, his whispers will tell him, or he will do whatever his whims dictate. Who knows what Trump will do? That's part of the thing about Trump is he is unpredictable. And it's impossible to know what exactly he will do. Justin says, is Elan against non-Jewish immigrants to Israel? I mean, there are lots of non-Jewish immigrants to Israel all the time. I don't know Elan's answer to this, but Israel has a very open immigration system, maybe not to citizenship, but certainly for work visas. There are hundreds of thousands of workers in Israel from Philippines and Thailand and China and India, Sri Lanka. My parents have a person living with them, kind of helping out from Sri Lanka, all legal immigrants, all basically, if you can match up with an employer in Israel, you can get a visa, so you can come and work. You can't become a citizen, but Israel's immigration policy is far more, legal immigration policy is far more open and accepting than America's. The Palestinians are not going to be allowed into Israel for a long time. They were up until October 7th, and yet they were many of the construction workers who worked in construction in Israel. So Israel's right now out there trying to find construction workers in the world, and bringing in people to do the work. So, immigration, citizenship, those are not the same concept. And Israel is a unique country in the sense that it is one of its primary functions as a country is to protect people who the world views as Jews. And I think it serves that function. And I think there's value in serving that function, particularly in a context in which anti-Semitism is alive and well. So it has this unique thing that it does, which is, serves as a place to which Jews can escape to. And I think that's not a completely irrational, in the world in which we live, that's not a completely irrational thing. In an ideal world, it wouldn't exist, but in this world, it needs to exist. And as a consequence, it needs to make sure that that is part of its mission, part of its essence, and part of its constitution that can never be changed. And part of that is to limit who is a citizen to people committed to that goal. And I think that's valid in the context of Israel today, in this world. How can one link up to an employer in Israel for someone who wishes to move there? I don't know. I mean, if you want to, there are employment agencies that probably specialize in this. You can probably look online. But right now, they're constantly hiring for elderly care. They're constantly hiring for construction work. And, my guess is that if you had if you had some skill in high tech, you can probably find somebody who would hire you in the tech space. But I don't know the details of how you would go around doing that. I would Google it. Mary Eileen, anecdotally, the Rothschilds were incredibly successful Jewish bankers dating back to the late 18th century. They were a financial dynasty. Yeah, and they still have a financial presence. But they're one of many. They're not the only ones. There were others. It's not surprising that almost every conspiracy theory out there ultimately boils down to Jewish bankers controlling the world, the Rothschilds being at the center of that. So all of the successful Jewish bankers ultimately landed up being a part of the big conspiracy theories that involve explanations for how the world works and explanations for how the Jews control the world. It seems like those conspiracy theories will not go away, will not go away. No, Zane says the World War II Axis ideas were dismantled via occupation and rebuilding. Can the U.S. dismantle Iran and achieve lasting peace without occupation, major investment? So I don't view it exactly like that. I don't think it was primarily through occupation and rebuilding. I think the ideas were dismantled through, uncompromising victory. Hiroshima and Nagasaki is what changed the Japanese minds about the world. Now, occupation solidified that through a constitution that the Americans crammed down their throat. I don't think rebuilding had much to do with it. I think even if they'd rebuilt themselves, they still would have adopted a new ideology, an ideology that rejected the old. I think the same is true in Germany. I don't think it's the Marshall Plan that made that possible. And the Marshall Plan, if you look back at it in terms of real dollars, is not that big in comparison to how much money today is spent on all kinds of things by the American government. I don't think it would be that hard to occupy Iran, but I don't think it would be necessary in the sense that I mentioned earlier. Iran, if it is thoroughly defeated, falls back on a real tendency towards Western civilization, towards Western values that the Iranians have. But in order for that to come to the forefront, the current ideology has to be crushed. It has to be defeated. It has to be shown to be the failure that it is. And it wouldn't take much to do that. So Iran has a massive population, maybe a majority, that wants this regime gone and wants a Western-like society. And the issue is getting to the point where the reins can be handed to them without occupation and without significant investment in rebuilding. And I think all of that is possible. I think Iran would be a country a lot of companies would like to invest in. So you could rebuild it through private capital without the state taxpayers having to fund the rebuilding. And you could do it a lot cheaper too. And if you develop the oil fields that they have and the natural gas fields and the capacity and the reserves, you could self-fund rebuilding through that. All right, Daniel, I enjoyed how lucidly written Elan's book is. Any good writing advice? Terrible broad question, I realize. I would read Ayn Rand's nonfiction writing course, which is in book form. And then I would take the writing class at the Ayn Rand Institute. Sign up for Ayn Rand University and take the writing class. And I think you'd benefit, all of us would benefit enormously from taking that class and improving your writing skills. I'm sorry Elan's not here to answer that question, but I think he would second what I just said. Michael says, do you have any sense of what Israel's view on American foreign policy impact on their lives is? I mean, I think most Israelis feel like America is too involved, too interventionist. They value America's friendship. They value America's support, selling arms to Israel and so on. It's financial support, although, but they also don't like that the U.S. dabbles and tries to influence and tries to twist Israel's hand in terms of how to deal with Israel's problems. I think most Israelis resent that and want that over with and gone. So yeah, that is. All right, let me just thank Enric and Mary Aline and Andy. I'm looking at all and D. Some of these are first-time super chatters, like Michael is a first-time super chatter. Thank you, Michael. And Wes and Mary Aline again, and Carolina. And let's see, who else do we have? More Carolina, Silvanos. Thank you, Silvanos. Michael Dial. Mike Dial. Thank you all for Ryan. Thank you all for the super chats, for the stickers. Really, really appreciate it. Enric, let me just say that, you know, this is the 1 year to September 7th. September 7th was a devastating, horrific, truly disturbing day. I mean, I don't know how many of you have put the time in and the emotional effort to actually watch the videos of what happened on that day. I think it really gives one a sense of the real barbarism that was involved, the sheer barbaric nature of Hamas and the Palestinians. The glee that they took in raping, humiliating, torturing, burning their victims, murdering them, gang raping them. To see that is a window into kind of human barbarity that we know existed. We know how this is how wars were fought long, long time ago. We see it like on television and action movies and the horrors of, I don't know, the Conan the Barbarian periods of time. But we've all thought that we are beyond that. What we saw on October 7th was that the Palestinians are not. Not only did they do it, but the ones who didn't do it cheated on, celebrated it, and are celebrating again today. And then we had our barbarians at our university colleges celebrate barbarity. I think more than 9/11, because this was so much more barbaric in a sense. It was so much more personal. It was so much more visceral. It was so much more in your face, and we have video of it, and everything that they did. It wasn't just the Palestinians committing suicide and blowing people up. It was them relishing the torture and destruction, and again, rape and pillage and everything they did to human beings. This should have been a wake-up call. The demonstrations on campus should have been a wake-up call. There is something deeply rotten in the West, and something deeply, deeply rotten among the Palestinians. There's something unbelievably corrupt and barbaric about the Palestinian people. It's not genetic, it's not inherent, but it's how they act and who they are. And to not see that, to not acknowledge that, and to recognize that one cannot negotiate with barbarism is just stunning. It's, you know, this was a moment where the West could have woken up after all the terrorist attacks of the last 30 years. How horrible they are. This was a culmination, a crescendo of destruction. And for the West, in a sense, to just shrug it off. Yeah, sorry, Israel. Yeah, that was really bad, really horrible. Don't overreact, though. Is despicable and shows a real moral rot. I mean, the response in the West should have been, whoa, all right, now we realize what you're dealing with, Israel. Crush them. Please, crush them. And, we'll talk after you crush them. Here's the resources if you need any help to do it, because we know we share this enemy with you. This is the same enemy that commits terrorist attacks in Germany and France. The same enemy that wants Sharia law to dominate the world. Please do this for us. And then to see what happened in university campuses. And well, some people woke up from it partially a little bit. It was not universal. The response was mild, demanding the resignation of president, mild in comparison to what these people on these university campuses actually represent, how low they are, how evil they are, how much evasion is going on there, and what they are glorifying, the meaning of glorifying the evil that they are glorifying, the meaning of that Americans don't see it. That there's not universal condemnation of this. That there's not horror at what is going on in our campuses to produce Americans. We're not talking about Middle Easterners, Americans who believe this. It's just a phenomena of burying our head in the sand, evading. There is a moral rot, not with the students. It's much worse than moral rot. There's a real evil. There's a moral rot in America that is now responding to this by completely rethinking our values, our education system, our government, our leadership. Truly stunning. Truly stunning. And, I think 10/7 is a good time to think about that, about what's necessary to change this, what's necessary to wake people up, well, it's not even wake them up, to re-educate them, to move this country in the proper direction. And God, the politics of the moment are not the appropriate response, are not the right response. We are just going to perpetuate whatever brought about this rot in our campuses. We're just going to perpetuate it. It's not going to go away because we're not willing to challenge the cause. We're not willing to stand up to them. We're not willing to stand up to their professors. We're not willing to stand up to the curriculum. We're not willing to stand up to the rotten ideas that they represent. And everybody's moderate. Everybody's compromising. Everybody's, yeah, there are two sides to this issue. Yeah, these students are terrible. But, Israel maybe is going too far. That attitude is killing the West. It will kill the West. And the remedy to that is an intellectual revolution that has to happen. And that intellectual revolution has to be a revolution that resurrects the Enlightenment. It's exact opposite of the direction intellectuals are moving towards today. Our intellectuals are moving towards confronting barbarism with barbarism, confronting the barbarism of campus and the barbarism of the Middle East with the barbarism of Christianity or the barbarism of the past, instead of embracing a future-oriented philosophy, a future-oriented perspective, a perspective of an orientation based on reason and individualism, the perspective of our founding fathers, the perspective that made this country great. And somehow We have to remind this country of what it actually represents, what it actually means, what it actually stands for. That in a world of individual rights, capitalism, individual freedom, in a world where individualism, individual moral right to happiness is cherished, Hamas, Hezbollah, and these students and campuses cannot be tolerated. Cannot be tolerated. I mean, Hamas and Hezbollah need to be dealt with in one way. These students have to be dealt with another way. And again, the only way to deal with them is by resurrecting those ideas and bolstering them with, hopefully, with Ayn Rand's philosophy. All right. I will see you guys tomorrow. I know I said my surgery was on Tuesday, but I was confused. My surgery is on Wednesday. So there will be a show tomorrow. I will see you tomorrow, probably at 2 o'clock, 2 p.m. East Coast time. Thank you to all the super chatters. Thank you to everybody for supporting the show. Thank you, Elan, for joining us. And we will continue. The fight goes on. See you guys. Thanks.